Hailing from New Zealand, Pacific Jade is a hop variety that's known to impart beer with bold herbal, fresh citrus and black pepper notes. Given its high alpha acid content, Pacific Jade can be used in smaller additions early in the process, while many have found favour with the complex characteristics associated with later additions. But what would a beer made with only Pacific Jade taste like? To find out, I'm brewing a pale ale, taking steps to maximise hop pungency along the way, then serving the beer to tasters. What will they think? Let's find out. This episode is sponsored by Kegland. More on them in a bit. Alright, let's get brewing. Measured out my water salts already for this beer. I've got 8 grams of gypsum in here and 3 grams of calcium chloride. So give me a somewhat hoppy profile. And in with grains. So in here I have got pretty simple malt bill. This is our standard, the Hop Chronicles malt bill for a pale ale. I've added 10 pounds of pale malt. Specifically I'm using Foundation malt from Epiphany Craft Malt, and then to that I'm adding 2 pounds of Vienna malt. Nice basic recipe. Add a little bit of biscuity character to the beer and create a nice malt base for these Pacific Jade hops to shine. So I'm going to be mashing this one at 152 Fahrenheit or 67 Celsius. I'm going to mash for about an hour, and while that's mashing, let me tell you about the noble cause for today's brew. It's very noble. So what's my noble cause? It's to free the hops. It's a noble cause because I'm using Pacific Jade, which is derived from a noble hop. Noble cause, noble hop. That's the joke. Yeah, but what do I mean by that? Well, I just feel like I am not getting the correct amount of hop utilization out of my beers in general. And I actually have some scientific evidence that that is the case. I did send one of my beers to White Labs for analysis, and the IBUs that were actually in the beer versus what I was expecting were way off. So I'm going to do a couple of things today to try to maximize the extraction of the hop oils in this beer. Now, the first thing is something I've done before, which is these guys, hop spiders. I use hop spiders so that I can keep the hops in the kettle and they don't get set into my fermenter. But I don't know, I mean, look at this mesh. Am I really fully extracting all of the hops from this? Well, I did test this out in an experiment where I brewed one beer with a hop spider and then one beer that did not use a hop spider, and then presented the beers to participants, see if they could tell the difference. They couldn't. That came back as a non-significant result. But I also sent the beers to apartment brewer Steve, and he could tell a difference. So if he can tell a difference, maybe there really is a difference there. So I'm going to use his process for putting hops directly into my kettle again today, which means taking this guy here out. This is the bazooka screen from my kettle, and that means now I can just put the hops directly into the kettle, and then I'm going to do a little whirlpool stage at the end to just put them into a cone so they don't end up in my fermenter. I also am going to do some stuff in the fermentation side as well, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Pacific Jade was released from the New Zealand Hort Research Programme in 2004, and it was developed as a cross of 2 hops, of First Choice and then an old line SARS male. Now, First Choice was a new one on me, but turns out it was grown commercially in New Zealand between the 1960s and the 1980s, and it's no longer in production. Now, Pacific Jade is a high alpha acid hop, typically clocking in between 12 and 14% AA, and has notable levels of myrcene and humulene. Its aroma is described as bold notes of herbal, fresh citrus and black pepper. And as for my use of Pacific Jade, well, I'm looking to build a beer here with an IBU of 40. Given that the batch of Pacific Jade I'm using has an alpha acid rating of 11.7%, I've elected to skip the 60-minute addition entirely. So instead, I'm adding 14 grams of Pacific Jade at 30 minutes, and another 14 grams will go in at 10 minutes, and that will get me most of my way to my IBU target. But I'm also making more additions. 28 grams at 5 minutes, and then 56 grams at 2 minutes. And
There'll be more going into the dry hop as well. So in total, 168 grams of Pacific Jade hops will be finding their way into my 5-gallon batch of beer.
Now let's talk about fermentation vessel. I'm going to be using the X2 fermenter. This is a conical fermenter from Brewbuild, and it's got a glycol jacket built in, which is kind of nice. Now I'm going to be dry hopping this beer, and I don't want to have to bag up my hops. With some of my other fermenters, I do need to bag them so they don't block up all of my piping and tubing. But this guy doesn't have that problem because it incorporates a floating dip tube. And on the end of the floating dip tube is this little screen here to stop it getting blocked up with hop debris. So I can just throw my hops directly in here. But the other thing I want to be concerned of is hop aroma, and I don't want any hop aromas to be escaping unnecessarily. Now, typically I will open up a fermenter and then drop the hops in. Well, that's letting out a whole load of aroma that's inside of the fermenter. It really smells delicious when I do that, but I would rather keep that aroma as much as possible in the fermenter. So for that, I'm going to be using a hop dropper. This is a hop bong from Kegland, and then I have a valve on it as well. So the idea is I'll add my hops into here, pressurize this so it's the same pressure as the keg, then that will dump them in. Now I've got more ports on this thing and it's a shame to let them go to waste. So on this port here, I'm adding a spunning valve and pressure gauge. I actually don't think I'm going to need the spunning valve, it's just going to be there for backup. But I do want to keep an eye on the pressure that's in the keg. So I'm actually going to close this spunning valve off, so it's not going to release any gas. I'm actually going to vent this keg using the gas in post. Now this is a tip I got from Alex, the cheapskate brewer from Brülosophy, and he uses CO2 in his fermenter to purge his kegs. So the idea being that fermentation creates CO2, that is then put into one of his kegs, that pushes out all of the water and star sand that's in his keg and replaces it with CO2 from the fermentation. That sounds like a really nice idea of keeping some of these hop aromas inside of the keg. I'm going to be pumping in CO2 into my keg that is like hoppy CO2 from the aromas that are in here. Sounds like a good plan. So that's the end of the boil. Now I've got all the hop matter in the kettle here. Don't want it in my fermenter. So what I'm going to do now is create a whirlpool. So the way I'm going to do that is I have this whirlpool arm in here, and I also am chilling the wort at the same time. So what I'm doing right now is I'm pumping out of here into my counterflow chiller. The counterflow chiller is then pumping the wort back into here. This goes into the kettle and it's going to start to form a whirlpool. So I'm chilling and creating a whirlpool at the same time. I'm going to do this until I get to pretty close to my pitching temperature. And then I'm just going to turn the pump off and let this sit for about 15 minutes. And that should then result in a clump of hops in the center, kind of in a cone. And then I'll be able to rack into my fermenter. So I've transferred my wort into my fermenter and chilled it down to 66 Fahrenheit or 19 Celsius. And I've added my yeast. That is A07 flagship from Imperial Yeast. And now I've hooked everything up. So I have got the gas post of the fermenter connected to the gas post of a keg that is filled with star sand water. Then the liquid post of that filled keg is connected to the liquid post of an empty keg. And then the gas post of the empty keg is connected to a spunning valve, which is set between 2 and 3 psi of pressure.
So how will this beer turn out? Well, before we get to that, a quick word on today's sponsor, Kegland. Kegland are the ultimate destination for all your brewing and dispensing requirements. For example, they offer the reusable Oxybar kegs, which are perfect for sharing beers with friends. I'm a big fan of the versatile duo-tight system for liquid and gas hookups, and I serve my beers through NukaTap draft beer taps. Kegland also have a killer YouTube channel hosted by Key where you can learn all about their latest products. Check out all Kegland have to offer at kegland.com.au. Alright, let's check in on how fermentation is doing.
It's been about 5 days since brew day now, and this keg setup, it worked really well. So I've got my middle keg here, which was originally full of water and star sand. Now is completely empty. It's just got CO2 in it from the fermentation. And then I have my second keg here, which I don't want to pick up because, full of water and star sand. It totally worked. And when I look at my spunding valve, I've got a couple of psi of pressure in this whole system. So it's time to add the hops. I've got 56 grams of Pacific Jade. I'm going to use this hop dropper here, this hop bong. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, just purge it in case there's any pressure. There isn't. Take the top off. Add my hops in. Right, now before I just drop these hops into the fermenter, I'm a little bit concerned about this section here because that is full of air. Boo, we don't want any air in this thing. So I'm going to flush this with CO2. CO2 that I'm going to get from the keg that's been collecting the CO2 from the fermenter. So I'm just going to disconnect this. This is under a couple of psi of pressure now. So when I connect this here, there we go. So the idea is now I'm taking CO2 that I've collected in my empty keg and I am pushing it into here, and that will displace the air that's in here, which is coming up through here. Okay, everything should now be theoretically at the same pressure, and drop this into the fermenter. That's it. That is a hop addition without introducing too much outside oxygen into this thing, and I can't smell anything, so the aromas, they're still in there.
Now, to my palate, this beer came out so very, very well. The pungent citrus was balanced by a subtle peppery note that created a multi-dimensional flavour profile that I loved. So much so, in fact, that unlike my usual Hop Chronicle beers, I wanted Norm to give this one a try as well. Only trouble was, there was so much foam, Norm had trouble getting to taste the beer at all, and there was a reason for that.
Let me do the... Yep, it's not going down either. That's a very creamy foam.
I poured these maybe 10 minutes ago,
I know.
Something like that, right?
Insane how foamy and creamy that is.
It was a little bit overcarbonated.
Right.
It's settled down, but it has kept this level of foam.
Yep.
I did perform a slow cold crash on this beer. So every 12 hours, I reduced the temperature by 3 degrees Celsius, following what John Palmer told me would help with head retention.
Oh,
so
wow.
If you crash the beer too fast, you can create something called thermal shock.
Okay.
Which applies to the yeast. The yeast excrete lipids like waxes and stuff like that. And those waxes kill the head retention on the beer. So you just get, within a few minutes, like a flat surface.
Right.
This one being crashed slowly has really held up the head retention.
Yeah, I would say this is a pretty dramatic outlier from most of the stuff you've brewed that I've tasted, where the head retention has been kind of on the thin side.
Yes.
Compared to this, which, like you said, I mean, look at that. That's almost like it's got whipped cream sitting on top of the beer.
Really. Now, a total of 17 people participated in the evaluation of this beer, all blind to the hop variety used until after they completed a survey. What do they think? Well, in terms of both aroma and flavour, citrus and tropical fruit were the most endorsed characteristics by some margin. Some participants also noted a touch of stone fruit. Now, both aroma and flavour characteristics really were very closely lined up here. Now, next, participants were asked to rate the pungency of the hop. The majority of participants rated this as moderate, and one participant even went as far as to rate this as strong. I'm taking this as a win for my careful closed fermentation methods. Tasters were then instructed to identify beer styles they thought the hop would work well in. As usual, IPA and Pale Ale scored highest, while 3 participants thought a blonde ale would be a good choice, which I totally get. Finally, participants were asked to rate how much they enjoyed the hop character on a 0 to 10 scale. There was very little consensus here, although most votes were on the positive end of the scale. So that's Pacific Jade, and I have to tell you, I am most definitely a fan. Now, if you want to learn more about the head retention hack that Norm and I were discussing, well, you can learn all about that in this video here.